All right, lesson 3 here is on slavery and the impact on the Civil War. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of go through this lesson. I promised I would keep them a little bit shorter. First thing I want you to know is slavery and the Civil War is a huge topic within the United States history. It's also something that's really difficult to kind of comprehend and talk about in maybe the correct fashion. Slavery in particular is really kind of a touchy subject and one that is difficult to approach the right way. So I'm going to do my best to kind of shed some light on it, and I'll go through this lesson and we'll talk about it and its impact on the Civil War. So first off, just kind of a little background on slavery in our country. It started in the 1600s, and it was a way to kind of replace indentured servitude. Indentured servitude is when you have to work for somebody when you owe them money. Slavery ultimately started to replace that because it was cheaper for plantation owners to purchase slaves rather than have somebody work for them and then ultimately work for their own freedom. So slavery was started in the 1600s, so it was all over, North colonies, South colonies. This wasn't just isolated to, the colonies in the South. All throughout the 1700s and the early 1800s, slaves could be found necessarily anywhere, but as time went on, it became increasingly specific to the southern colonies and then ultimately the states after we go through the American Revolution. Now, we talked about it, when we started 7th grade social studies. When we looked at the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, there is no mention or no talking about slavery. One of the things we always talk about is how the Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal. We looked at many examples, but primarily slaves, where all men are created equal does not apply. And that is one thing that, as our country starts to kind of divide here, that's one thing that kind of comes back into, well, all men are created equal, except for, in this case, African Americans aren't viewed as, all men. And in fact, in the Declaration and in the Constitution, they use a lot of only free persons and all other persons. They'll never say slaves. They'll come back to this all other persons, but that is kind of their way of getting around it. Now, as our government was being formed, and Congress, was kind of first getting its start, there was a lot of argument about what to do with slaves in terms of taxation and representation. The southern states wanted slaves to be counted as people so that they could use them to get more representation. The northern states wanted slaves to be counted so that they could be charged more taxes. And ultimately they settled on the 3/5 compromise. Again, I mentioned this, kind of throughout that first unit there, but that's really that should be our first sign of how our country really didn't do a great job of treating other peoples. We're isolating a group and basically calling them 3/5 of a person, and that kind of should be our first clue of, we don't view African Americans as equals. We're only viewing them as 3/5 of a person. Now I'm going to kind of go through the life of slavery, just a few things that I noted from our book. The biggest thing that I can say is slaves were viewed as property and not people. That's really an unfortunate situation, but slave owners, they really viewed African American slaves as property. They could buy, they could sell, they could do whatever they felt like was right because they felt like they owned them. And that was, that was how slavery was set up, as, they just viewed them as property and not people, and they were free to do whatever they pleased. So some ways that slave owners decided to, or controlled the slaves, were something called restrictive codes. What these restrictive codes is, it basically prevented them from being able to become educated through preventing them to learn to read and write. They really controlled their movements, very little outside of their own plantations. That way they couldn't organize, they couldn't visit, and so that was one way to kind of control things that went on, was with restrictive codes. A lot of times on farms and plantations, they divided into a hierarchy. People that were more skilled did artisan work. They built things, blacksmithing, those types of things. If you were really fortunate, you were a house worker like a maid or a butler. Typically, that usually meant you were treated a little bit better. Not necessarily that you were treated well or that things were great for you, but the lowest class was the field workers, people who worked on fields, attended crops, specifically cotton. We know a lot about, and those people were really subjected to poor clothing, living conditions, and food. Life as a slave, you can imagine, was really tough. Field workers in particular worked from sun up to sundown, no lunch breaks. All right, all throughout the day, didn't matter, sick, hot, cold, rainy, sun up to sundown, you were working. And then you can pretty much imagine, there were punishments for disobedience. There was probably a wide variety of those tactics, all of which, the slave owners used to kind of control slaves and really make them dependent and fearful. That was the one thing that they wanted over them, was that fear of, if I do something wrong, what's going to happen? Now, for slave families, the biggest fear a lot of times for them was not necessarily any punishment or anything like that. It was being sold away from their family. They were afraid that, their family would get split up and they wouldn't be able to see each other. Now, there was a lot of ways that slavery was being challenged. The first way, a lot of times, was slaves would try to run away, whether that was short-term or long-term, but it was very difficult to make it to the north from the southern states. A long way to travel, could easily be caught, and obviously, when they're caught, then punishment would take place. There were a few instances of rebellion. Nat Turner's rebellion is probably the most popular or most well-known. A group of slaves basically revolted, were able to kill their slave families. They went around to different plantations within the county, tried to work up, get more people to rebel. It was working until obviously they were caught and they were punished for their crimes. Now, the Underground Railroad, this is one that's actually going to come up in lesson, in actually our third unit, the last part of the Civil War that we're going to look at. But the Underground Railroad was a network of people who arranged transportation and hiding places for escaped slaves. So it wasn't necessarily like an actual railroad, but it was a way for people to escape slavery. Robert Purvis, Harriet Tubman, you probably recognize, are two of the most famous people that worked on the Underground Railroad. And it's something that we're going to have a chance to study and look at later. But it was really one way for slaves to be able to kind of escape. And one other thing that was an option, although not easy to do, some slaves made enough money to buy their own freedom. One way to do that is if you were like a blacksmith or somebody who, was a little more skilled, you were able to maybe make things and sell things on your own. Any money that you got, you saved up and you tried to buy your freedom. Then typically what happened is when you buy your freedom, you do something to try and make more money to come back to maybe purchase members of your family and kind of work from there. So there are instances of that happening. Again, it's not super easy to do just because the slave owners controlled everything that was going on. Now, there was a lot of opposition to abolishing slavery. We obviously know the southern states were very against abolishing slavery, but they weren't the only ones as well. A lot of northern factory workers, they were very afraid that these people, if slaves were free, were going to come and take their jobs because they could work for less money. That was just kind of their fear. Whether that was true or not, probably wasn't, but that was just something that was in their mind, that political leaders and people in the South said, if you free these slaves, that's what's going to happen. A lot of people in the government, specifically the House and the Senate, really didn't want to talk about slavery. The Southern congressmen, obviously, they just didn't want to discuss slavery at all, but a lot of Northern congressmen didn't want to discuss it at all either. They very much wanted to remain hush-hush, partly because they probably didn't want to be on either side of things. They didn't want people who were against slavery to be against them, and then if they spoke out, they didn't want people on their side getting upset either. So that's kind of what happened there with the opposition. Now, one big thing that happened was the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Now, the Fugitive Slave Law is exactly what it sounds like. It made it a federal crime to assist runaway slaves and allowed the slaves to be arrested even in areas where slavery was illegal. So it kind of goes back to the Dred Scott thing. If you, in this case, if you're a runaway slave and you're caught, let's say in Pennsylvania, a state that was free, it didn't matter. That was still legal, and you could be arrested and sent back. Now, slaveholders and their agents could take suspected fugitive slaves to prove ownership through documents or testimony. You brought them, if you caught a slave, you brought them to somebody called a commissioner. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Commissioners were paid $5 for hearing a case and letting a slave go. But if you found them basically guilty and returned them, you were given $10. So if you're a commissioner and you are hearing a case, you get $5 for letting somebody go and $10 for returning them. Well, your incentive is, whether people are lying or not, is to return them and make more money. And the hard part is, these accused fugitives, because they're African American, couldn't even testify in their own defense. They couldn't say anything. It was up to the slave holder to just basically be like, yeah, they're my slave. They ran away. They were working on my plantation, and accused fugitives couldn't even say anything. Now, if you were caught helping fugitive slaves disappear, 6 months in jail and $1,000 fine for helping fugitive slaves escape. And in the 10 years that the fugitive slave law happened, there were 343 cases that were heard, and only 11 times were they deemed free. Think about that. 11 out of 343. That's just a crazy, crazy number. Now, in lesson 2, we talked a lot about the arguments over slavery. This goes back, from all the way to the 3/5 Compromise, when their Constitution is first being written, all the way up through the Missouri Compromise in 1820, the Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the split of political parties, and all the way up into 1860s. All of these deal with the argument over slavery. We couldn't decide what we wanted to do, and that really just kind of shows how difficult the topic was, and really, as a country, we weren't sure what we wanted to do. And lastly, one kind of event that I wanted to point out was John Brown's raid. Now, John Brown was an abolitionist from the North. He said slavery should be abolished. So what he decided to do was get a group of men and entered a place called Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And they captured the federal arsenal. So they took federal weapons out of basically storage in this Virginia town. When all of his men had weapons, they went into the countryside and they basically went to different plantations and tried to urge slaves, hey, help us, we're going to rebel, come to Harper's Ferry and join our fight. What happened then? No slaves joined. He could not convince any slaves to join, and that goes back to so many people were afraid of what was going to happen to them if they were caught rebelling or going against their slave owners, and that's that control that they demonstrated. So what happened then? Southerners armed themselves and attacked Brown, killing 8 of his men. Brown escaped, but he had to retreat to a firehouse. Robert E. Lee ordered the Marines to storm the firehouse, killing 2 more and capturing the rest. He was convicted of treason, murder, and conspiracy to incite slave rebellion. So John Brown, for some people, was a hero. He stood up for what is right. For people in the South, he was a martyr, somebody who committed murder and treason. And it really depends on which side of things you're on. So that's going to be kind of where I stop. Again, this is just a very, very brief topic of slavery. It's very complex. There's a lot of layers to it. But I just did my best to kind of give you a little introduction here. For you guys next, you need to answer the discussion in Schoology. And then coming up in lesson 4 are some of the things that we're going to be talking about. President Lincoln, the Confederacy being formed, the Civil War actually starting, Emancipation Proclamation, Gettysburg Address. We're just going to talk about, everything that kind of leads up to the battles and the fighting, which we will start talking about soon. So answer that discussion question on Schoology, and then we will see you guys next time for class.